Well, just so there's no confusion about this, right from the outset, let me say that I just love Boeing. I love Boeing's history anyway, and I mean, who wouldn't? They make the best big airplanes in the world. The B-17 Fighting Fortress, the iconic bomber of World War II, that was built by Boeing. The B-29 Super Fortress, which delivered the atomic bomb and had so many unbelievable technological innovations, that's a Boeing airplane. The Stratocruiser, based on the Super Fortress that my mom served as a flight attendant on, was the last of the piston engine airliners. The B-52 Stratofortress, that's a Boeing jet. The 737, the ubiquitous jetliner, the jetliner that is essentially open jet travel to everyone, by far the most popular jetliner in the history of the world, is a Boeing airplane. The 747, the jumbo jet, the first wide-body jet, the first jet to use the high bypass engines, another engineering marvel, was built by Boeing. The 787 Dreamliner, beautiful airplane, had some teething problems, but it's an astonishing plane. The 777, longest range airplane in the world, huge airplane with only 2 engines. And let's not forget that Boeing built the first stage of the Saturn V rocket, and despite the impressiveness of the Starship, nothing is ever going to look like a Saturn V first stage with those 5 F1 main engines firing. My personal favorite Boeing airplane is the 707. It was the world's first successful jetliner, and parenthetically, we don't fly any faster today in our regular trips from Los Angeles to New York or wherever than we did back in 1963 when I took my first ride on a Boeing 707. It's still about 550 miles an hour. And as a kid who grew up overseas, seeing a Boeing 707 on the ramp in Pan Am colors with the American flag on the tail and that one-of-a-kind spike up at the top for the pitot tube. Boeing 707, for me and for millions of other people, that was America. I love Boeing. So, what the hell is wrong with Boeing? What is going on? We just found out now that Boeing's Starliner, not to be confused with the Spacex Starship, which has been under development for years and years and years, has got another problem with the valve, something basic, something that should have been solved a long time ago. It bears mentioning, by the way, that Boeing built the Saturn V first stage well over 50 years ago, the most amazing single rocket in the history of the world. The Saturn V first stage is just simply it. It's an astonishing piece of engineering well over 50 years ago, and now they can't get anything off the pad. Their capsules have problems. The Boeing spacesuit isn't working. What happened to Boeing? Well, the reason I wanted to talk about Boeing is because what happened to Boeing is the same thing that's happened to America. They're very, very similar. And so I'm going to call it the Boeing Effect, not because it's unique to Boeing, but because it's easy to see if you can isolate it down to one particular company. Here's a company that was the leader in innovation, absolutely the best engineers in the world, setting records, pushing the envelope again and again and again, and now they cannot get off the pad. They're not even in consideration now for NASA. And parenthetically, the Boeing Effect applies to NASA as well. NASA used to be an extremely capable, competent, confident agency that accomplished the impossible. That's why Boeing and NASA will always be dear to my heart, no matter how badly degraded and out of whack they eventually become. What they have done in the past will always have my love and respect. But neither one of them is even on the board today in terms of capability or vision or competence, anything like that. So what happened to Boeing? And what happened to NASA? And what happened to America? Glenn Reynolds referred to SpaceX as the America that works. And he's right. So what happened to Boeing, and why is SpaceX successful? Well, there's lots and lots and lots of reasons. We're not going to get into all of them because we don't need to. There's only one thing really that explains the Boeing effect. Why Boeing doesn't work anymore, and why NASA doesn't work anymore, and why so much of America doesn't work anymore is very, very, very simple. They're too big. They're too big, and that's all there is to it. They're too big. They're too expensive. They're too slow. They're too fossilized. They're too rigid. They're too big. And when something gets to be that big, it no longer can function, let alone function effectively. Let's take the 737 MAX, for example. A public relations catastrophe. But I took a very in-depth look at that based on a remarkable article by a trusted aviation writer, 20 or 30 page article on the 737 MAX. And the reason that the 737 MAX had those two crashes was because Boeing was selling so many jetliners to the third world, and third world pilots, as a general rule, were pilots with just 1,000 hours of flight time in some cases. I've got 1,000 hours in an instrument rating, and furthermore, I was trained as a pilot. So many of these Boeing 737s were being sold to countries that were putting pilots in those airplanes who were pilots in the sense that they could follow the items on a checklist, and as long as nothing went wrong, they'd probably be okay. But things kept going wrong, and what kept going wrong was the planes were stalling. They were flying too slow. So Boeing, on the 737 MAX, decided to put in a feature that would automatically lower the nose if the pitch angle got so high that the plane was in danger of stalling and falling out of the sky, and the road to hell being paved with good intentions. The entire reason for this was to keep inexperienced pilots of 737s out of trouble. So far, so good. But now the Boeing effect begins to make its ugly face known. Political correctness being what it is, Boeing couldn't just come out and say that. Couldn't just say that we're putting this in because third world pilots are, generally speaking, not nearly as experienced as American or Western pilots, and therefore we're putting in this safety feature. So since they couldn't say it, they didn't. And since they didn't say it, no one knew about it. And not even the American pilots flying the Boeing 737 MAX knew about this particular piece of software addition designed to save airplanes. And they probably never would have known about it because of the level of training of American and Western pilots. And furthermore, American and Western pilots being trained as pilots, at least so far, know that when you have a situation with that pitch down, that runaway pitch down caused by this introduction to the 737 MAX's flight software, the first thing on the checklist for runaway trim is pull the circuit breakers, which are right in front of you. Of the two planes that crashed, neither of those crews did that. They just flew around wondering what was happening. But that's not the point. The point is Boeing didn't tell anybody. They didn't tell anybody because somebody in the corporate culture decided that the negative press would outweigh whatever advantages you might have. And so two jetliners went in. And now you begin to see why Boeing is no longer the Boeing that it used to be. Now you begin to see why they can't get valves right. Now you begin to see why their spacesuits don't work. Now you can begin to see why the Starliner and Orion and all the rest of it before that has been left in the dust by other, better, smaller, faster companies. It's exactly the same for NASA, and it's exactly the same for the United States. There's talk about spending $3.5 trillion. Remember the stimulus bill in 2008 that was so astonishingly expensive that we just fought tooth and nail? $800 billion. This bill that they're talking about passing now is 4 times that amount. 4 times that amount. Sooner or later, this kind of spending is going to bankrupt the economy. But nobody is responsible for it, you see. That's why the Boeing effect is so pernicious. Ultimately, what the Boeing effect is it is the evolution of a structure, a corporation, a government, agency like NASA, into a structure that becomes so big, so broad, so many layers, that there is no individual responsibility and no individual authority. And now we really get to the brass tacks, both politically and in terms of the business model. Because when Boeing was a great company, Boeing had competitors. The golden age of aviation was really in the late 50s and really mid-60s at Edwards Air Force Base here in California, when aviation records were being broken so quickly we couldn't keep track of them anymore. And it certainly is worth noting that that golden age was closer to the Wright brothers than it is to us today. But back when Boeing was being Boeing, Boeing wasn't alone out there. Not just for commercial jetliners, but for military contracts as well. It wasn't just Boeing. It was Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, Northrop, Grumman, Convair, North American, Rockwell, which became North American Rockwell. Douglas became McDonnell Douglas, then it became Lockheed, McDonnell, Douglas, Boeing, Northrop, and all of it. Now it's just one giant conglomerate, maybe two. They're not really in competition with each other. Back in those days, in order to get a contract, the company had to build a prototype. If the Air Force wanted a new fighter, every single one of those aerospace companies would build a fighter on their own dime, and they would fly them off, and determine which one of these would get the Air Force contract. And the Air Force during the 60s had, I don't know how many planes in service in the United States military. I mean, during the 60s, just off the Century series, at the same time, the Air Force was flying the F-100 Super Sabre, the Hun. They were flying the F-101 Voodoo, the F-102 Delta Dagger, the F-104 Starfighter, the F-105 Thunder Chief, the F-106 Delta Dart, plus the F-4 and any number of other aircraft as well. The Sky Raider was in there, the Skyhawk was in there. All of it was all flying, all competing, all going for the same dollar. And everybody was hungry, and everybody was pushing the envelope, and everybody had a dog in the hunt. Their money was on the line. Not our money, their money was on the line. Now, you've got Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop for the Jetliner trade, competing against Airbus, and both Airbus and the Boeing conglomerate are heavily subsidized by the governments that they represent, and that means that everything that made Boeing Boeing, and all the rest of them for that matter, is no longer there. It's too big, it's too fat, it's too slow, it's too expensive, it's too lazy. It is resting on its laurels, is what Boeing is doing, and that's what America's been doing a lot lately too, resting on its laurels. It's been so good at so many things for so long. We've made so much money, we've had such a powerful economy, we've generated so much revenue and enriched the entire world that now our government essentially thinks that money can just be printed, and what could possibly go wrong? So if you don't know why Boeing cannot make a spacesuit, cannot make a capsule that gets off the pad, cannot get a valve working on a rocket engine when they built the Saturn V first stage 50-some years ago, now you know why. Because the people that made Boeing aren't there anymore. Now the people that made Boeing are replaced by the people that grew up with Boeing being the leader in the world. And that's how they treat it. And it's the exact same thing with our federal government. All of it. All the way. Military too. Same thing. All of it. You got to be hungry. You got to be small. You got to be light. You know who else is a great example of the Boeing effect? Apple. Apple Computer. The story is well known, but let's tell it again anyway. You've got Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, two computer nerds, thinking, hey, you know what? There's a market for personal computers. So what do? Do they decide to start a business out of their own garage? No. No, they don't. They go to the leader in electronics and computing. They walk into IBM with their plans for a personal computer. And IBM, which had done the software for the Apollo program, which had become IBM by being innovative and forward-thinking. That's why IBM was IBM. So there's no need for personal computers. There may be a need for maybe, 1,500 computers in the world and never more than that. So once IBM fell to the Boeing effect, well before Boeing did, Jobs and Wozniak said, okay, well, we have no choice now. Now we have to do it in our garage. You know who else decided to build something in their own garage? Scaled Composites did, and Burt Rutan. Back in 2002, 2003, Burt Rutan was tired of watching NASA and the space shuttle just going round and round and round on the same track that John Glenn went around in 1961. So Burt went to Paul Allen of Microsoft, another example of the Boeing effect, I might add, Microsoft, and basically said, let's just build a space program. So Paul Allen wrote him a check. Paul Allen, by the way, was the first billionaire to have his own private space program. And he beat Richard Branson, and he beat Elon Musk, and he beat Jeff Bezos by a solid decade, I would say, something like that. So, with $10 million, which is what Boeing would charge to study the problem, Burt started on Spaceship One, and he built his own launch system, he built his own ground control system, built his own suborbital spacecraft, hired his own pilots, and I have seen Burt Rutan showing all of his unbelievable trophies in his house, including a couple of Collier trophies, the single greatest award in aviation. And the greatest pride I ever saw in Burt Rutan's eyes was when he pointed to a picture of the Scaled Composite team that built Spaceship One, and his greatest point of pride was not how many people there were, but how few. That's why Scaled did what it did, and that's why they did it so long ago. Once Branson got a hold of it, nothing happened. That's the Boeing effect. Lack of leadership, lack of responsibility. No one taking responsibility and no one with authority. That's why SpaceX is the America that works. SpaceX works because Elon Musk is willing to fail. Scaled Composites, won the X Prize because Burt Rutan was willing to fail. And furthermore, I might point out, having recently watched this Virgin Galactic flight and Bezos' first flight, Burt Rutan, on the side of his Spaceship One, put the tail number. He got a chance to pick his own tail number. You often do. And the tail number on Spaceship One was November 328 Kilo Foxtrot. November for North America, 328 for 328K, 328,000 feet. 328,000 feet is the Kármán line. And Burt Rutan knew that in order to get to space, as the legal definition, you had to pass 100 kilometers. Not 50 miles, 100 kilometers. And so he put it right on the vehicle, 328,000 feet. And if he'd made it to 327,999 feet, he would have failed, and he would have done it again. So, now you know. Big companies like Virgin Galactic can't get to the Kármán line, so big businessmen like Richard Branson defined down the goal. No, we didn't mean to get to 100 kilometers, we only wanted to get to 50 miles. Boeing is doing the exact same thing, and so is our government. So how do we find our way out of this? Well, we find our way out of this by getting small. Steve Martin had it right back in the 70s. Let's get small. We're seeing this today as I record this. The federal government will no longer protect our southern border. There are now even greater floods of immigrants to the southern border because Joe Biden and the Democrats have basically said, if you can get here, welcome home. And now we have a flood coming in from the southern border, and they're not Mexicans, they're Haitians. They're Haitians. Think about this for a minute. There are Haitians crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. If you use your advanced powers of logic, you realize that that means they had to get into Mexico first. And furthermore, somebody had to let them through Mexico and get to the U.S. border. Why don't we do something about that? We do have the means to put some pressure on the Mexican government, but we don't do it because the same reason that Boeing decided not to announce why they put that software into the 737 MAX. Because of political correctness, because of image, because of posing, because of all of these things. Let's get small. You will never see responsible accounting for the United States as it exists ever again. I hate to be the person to break that bad news to you, but it's true. With something this big, where $10 billion is a rounding error, $10,000 million. Where'd it go? I don't know, it got lost somewhere. It's not going to do it. That's not going to do it. The future, as always, it's always been this way, belongs to the new, the small, the light, the fast, the inexpensive, the quick to react. The little mammals that are underground, underneath the toes of the dinosaurs. So when that big rock hits and the big flash of light in the sky comes, the big, slow, stupid, heavy, fat dinosaurs get wiped out, and the little creatures move into their space, and eventually they become big creatures too, and then somebody else will move into their space. And now we come to the final lesson today in our sad story. The genius of America is not that we don't have these problems. The genius of America has always been that there was liquidity, lubrication, that a small company could in fact go out there and succeed and rapidly become Spacex or Apple or whatever the case may be. And as those companies got older and slower and more fossilized, newer companies would come up and take their place. This is what's supposed to happen. There's talk about General Motors going out of business. It deserves to go out of business. It should have gone out of business a long time ago and replaced with smaller companies produced by individual people with a team of hardworking, dedicated engineers who are doing something new that people will buy. Tesla, to a large effect, is doing that as well. Will this always be the case? No. And I'll simply close with this. Elon Musk has run a number of different companies, and he's run them very well. He is essentially inventing the future in front of our eyes. And as Glenn Reynolds pointed out, and as I said earlier, SpaceX represents the America that works. But Elon Musk will go down in history as a space and aviation pioneer. But if Elon Musk can figure out a way to do the one thing that no one else has ever figured out to do, he will become an immortal. If Elon Musk can figure out a way to prevent SpaceX from becoming Boeing in 50 years, especially after 50 years of tremendous success, then he'll have broken this cycle forever. But he won't do it, though, because that kind of problem is not an engineering problem. That's a physics problem. That's That's a thermodynamics problem. That's an entropy problem. That's a human problem. The Boeing effect is here. It's always been here. It always will be here. If we expect to be successful in the future, we'd better cast off all of this big, heavy, expensive stuff and get right back down to brass tacks and understand that we have to invent the future and invent our reputations on a daily basis. And the day that we stop innovating and start trying to keep other people out of the market is the beginning of that stopwatch where our days are numbered.